So I will begin with my perspective as a part-time student. One of the most central themes that we'll be reinforcing throughout this conversation is the importance and benefits of celebrating and embracing multiple aspects of one's identities when engaging in partnership work. So in the spirit of my role as a part-time student being a key part of my identity, I'm going to lay the foundation for the rest of the conversation by talking a little bit about the multiple roles I juggle in my experience as a part-time student. In my opinion, part-time student's label is misleading because the only thing that makes me a part-time student is my coursework load. But part-time students put in the same amount of hours as full-time students, just at different hours as it works for everyone's schedule. The first thing I wanted to talk about was program contributions. I was able to bring my personal and professional insight to the program, especially when creating school partnerships. Being in the classroom and being an active lab member allowed me to help with bridging the gap between research and practice. In my research lab at VCU, my role as a teacher and researcher has driven my desire to build community partnerships, in which I have been afforded the opportunity to do so with 2 current projects. My dissertation research and school partnership that underlies it is a direct result and reflection of the dual identity that I display. And based on the different hats that I wear in both my personal and professional life, I was invited to sit on a panel discussing the various careers in the ed psych field. Next, time commitment. Classes were often offered at 4 p.m. or 7 p.m., which made it difficult because I wouldn't leave work as a teacher sometimes until 4:30 on a good day. This often left me getting to class late pre-pandemic, and I also found it difficult to schedule meetings with professors and lab members because my availability was always after 4 p.m. And this often made me feel like I was always the difficult lab member because I had less availability during the day. But one thing that I will draw on is that my lab and partnership teams found a common time to hold lab meetings for all members to attend and fit well within their schedules. My sense of belonging, due to my schedule and outside commitments, being a parent and working full-time, I found it difficult to develop an in-person sense of community because I was always unable to attend events because they were set at a time that conflicted with my work schedule, and I was often only afforded the opportunity to watch the Zoom recordings. Lastly, funding and research opportunities. Speaking from my experience as a part-time student only, the funding opportunities available to me sometimes appears less than a full-time student's funding, and I also found it difficult to apply to external research opportunities because one of the many qualifications was that I needed to be a full-time student, which led me to believe that I needed to work 10 times harder in order to make myself known in the educational psychology field. VCU did accept me as a part-time student, and based on my experience in mentor conversations, I was surprised that educational psychology programs that I applied to did not accept part-time students. And this was a huge deciding factor for me, especially because I was 8 months pregnant when I started the program. Taken together, as Allison will elaborate on later in the presentation, as a part-time student, I think that I'm uniquely positioned to contribute to the educational psychology field, but often the structures of many educational psychology programs make it either extremely difficult or impossible for part-time students to embrace their identities and expertise that accompanies them.
Thank you, Destiny, for sharing your experiences. And so, inspired by our different identities and positionality and the importance of bringing them into the research space, we hope that this conversation will help all of us to first recognize various identities and how these identities and perspectives inform research university partnerships, develop strategies for utilizing identities to help close the gaps between research and practice, and finally to, especially drawing from the role of mentors, to incorporate their mentees' identities within the education field and develop mentorship strategies for scholars to recognize these identities.
So our first point, we want to draw on the identities in the education field, and we want to start with what roles or identities do you identify with in the education field? And this will guide our interactive activity. Can we have 2 volunteers, please? Thank you.
Pre-selected volunteers.
So we are going to ask you, so up here you can see that there are 4 categories, and the sticky notes correspond with the categories. So if you were, or if you are, a K-12 educator or administrator, can you raise your hand and a blue sticky note will be passed out to you?
At any point,
can you have more than one?
Yes.
Yeah. So at any point in time, if you identify with being either a K-12 educator and or an administrator.
Do they need pens?
Oh yes, we have
We've got some. Just didn't know if they needed it.
Thank you.
Might have to share.
Alright, our next category is if you held a leadership role or you were or are a policy stakeholder. Please raise your hand so you can get a green sticky note. Our next category is if you are a researcher or a professor.
Orange?
Yes. Raise your hand high so you get an orange sticky note.
So just to make clear, this is also, you said also for past?
Yes.
For used to be.
Yes. Our 4th category is if you were or you are a graduate student.
Yeah, sorry.
And then lastly, not to exclude anybody or if you don't see your past or current position up here, is raise your hand if you also had another career or position or role in the education field that is not up here. Raise it high so we can hand you a yellow sticky note, please.
Yeah, if you can think of another identity that you think is really kind of influential to the work that you do.
While the last few sticky notes are being passed out, the purpose of this activity was to show everyone how all identities are welcomed and nobody's identity fits into a single category.
For
For the second part of our conversation today, we're going to focus on researcher positionality, which isn't only naming your identities, as we've already started to do, but also examining how they influence you and your work. So to work through this, we'll answer this question and we'll share our answers, and then we invite you all to reflect on your positionality. And if you want, you can jot down some of those ideas on the sticky notes. I think there's a few pens floating around. And then if time permits, we'll come back to this at the end of the conversation. So with your research or positions in the education field, how have you thought about, or how has your work and perspectives you bring to the work begun to close the gap between research and practice?
So up here are a few key words that describe me and my research or positionality, which we can see is Black woman. Sorry, there's a typo. I'm a fourth year part-time PhD student, fifth year special education math teacher, and SPED department chair this year. You can see that I have students with abilities in quotations, and I will explain in a few minutes. But also asset-based approach, and then advocate for and teacher of youth and special education. So I am a Black woman who teaches in Richmond Public Schools as a fifth year special education math teacher and the new special education department chair this school year. I have the opportunity to interact with and teach students with disabilities, but through my eyes, these are students with various abilities that are necessary for creating unique learning environments. I am passionate about this work because I find it extremely important to censor student voices while trying to promote equity within the classroom, especially settings that include students with abilities. We cannot create pathways for change without the special education population, within the special education population, without centering their voices and allowing them to be a part of the change. This is why I believe this work is not only important to me as a researcher, but as I continue to advocate for and teach in special education.
So I am a fourth year graduate student. I'm also a full-time student, which I hadn't even thought to include in this until we started today. And I wanted to point that out too, because we've been talking about part-time and full-time students this whole time, and often when your identity is one of the norms, you often don't think of it. So I thought of that when we were presenting. It's like, oh, that's interesting. But my positionality affects both why I want to go into partnerships, how I enter and exist in partnerships, and then also my research. So specifically for my positionality, I focus on my racialized identity and experiences related to race, and then also my experiences within education. So I'm a mixed race, specifically Latina and white woman, and I grew up in a really colorblind context. Actually in our neighbor right now in North Dakota. And so we didn't really talk about race there, and then also I can count on both my hands, other than my family, all the people of color that were in the entire county that I lived in. And when I moved to Virginia, it was a lot more diverse, but we still did not talk about race very often and was still very colorblind. And so that affects how I go into partnerships and my research, because I always want to not take a colorblind approach, and I take a critical approach instead. And so I'm always trying to listen and learn and interrogate. And so I do that in partnerships as well. And for my experiences in education, I've only really had experiences as a student. I substitute taught for a handful of times and realized that on the educator side, I have no idea what's going on. And so when I go into these partnerships, I again try to listen and learn, and then also interrogate too, with taking a critical approach, but also really value everyone's experience and knowledge that we have in these partnerships, and that includes teachers, students, administrators, and to make sure to not only value them, but kind of push as much as I can as a graduate student. Luckily, we have wonderful leaders in our partnerships, but for them to be compensated for their experience and knowledge as well.
So as an assistant professor of educational psychology, my guiding objectives in pretty much everything that I do are to help amplify voices that are often overlooked in academic spaces, and to generate more equitable motivational experiences specifically for minoritized students. And my why as an educational psychologist is really directly inspired by my personal background and specifically by my intersecting areas of privilege. As a white cisgender woman raised in a household with a lot of socioeconomic privilege, I became increasingly aware as a student how privileged I was to be existing in spaces and in structures that were largely built for me. And since then, I've aimed to interrogate, disrupt, and dismantle structures that inequitably prevent so many students from bringing their entire selves into the classroom and prevent them from experiencing affirmation in those spaces. I also hold the unwavering conviction that our partnership work could not be responsibly conducted without the expertise and the voices of scholars of color, K-12 educators, and school partners. And as a result, despite being the principal investigator on a lot of the partnership work that I do, I strongly believe that I can make the greatest impact by creating space for others and amplifying voices of others, and entering that space really as a learner that's privileged to be there rather than as a teacher or a leader. Okay, so kind of along those lines, the next part of our conversation, we're going to transition to talking about mentorship. So in particular, we wanted all of you to consider the following question. For those of you who self-identify right now as a mentor, we wanted to encourage all of you to consider the question of how have you celebrated and incorporated your mentees' various identities when inviting them to work on projects with you. And if you self-identify as being a mentee, and kind of consistent with what Destiny was saying, I suspect that a lot of people in this room probably self-identify as both simultaneously. But if you self-identify as being a mentee, how have your various education identities been recognized? And so if you have any thoughts related to that question, feel free to write them down on your sticky notes or just think about them, and then time permitting, and it's looking like we're, dare I say, I should never say this about people, but making good time. So we'll have time to return to it. So just sort of jot any ideas down that you have, and then hopefully we'll have some time to return to it at the end. Just going to do that awkward pause because I want to make sure that everybody has time to think. Okay, so now I'm going to, in a way less kind of eloquent way than Corey and Destiny have so far, I'm going to ramble on a little bit about mentorship and what I've learned, especially as it relates to the goals of this presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, when talking about researcher positionality, when I assume a mentorship role, something that's really kind of central to guiding my philosophy is that I think that it's really important, of course, to be a leader and a supporter and an advocate for the people that I mentor, and I'm privileged to mentor. However, I would argue that I think that a huge part of doing so successfully is positioning myself as a learner in that space. I learn all the time from much more experienced mentors than me. I learn all the time from mentors with less experience than me, and perhaps most importantly, I learn all the time from my students. And one of the things, and this is of course an important theme throughout this presentation, but one of the things that I really appreciate about VCU's educational psychology program, in addition to University of Oklahoma, where I'll be transitioning shortly, is that both of these programs accept full-time and part-time students. And here's where my kind of like rambling reflections come in. As we were all kind of thinking about this presentation and what we wanted to communicate, one of the really important themes that we landed on is the realization, and again, as usual, this was really Corey and Destiny's thinking, and I'm just expressing it, but the realization that thinking about part-time students in particular, they are uniquely positioned in a way that I would argue that nobody else in our field is, in the sense that quite often part-time students like Destiny, for example, hold a position in a more applied education setting and simultaneously they're pursuing scholarly activity in our kind of educational psychology space. Many, as is kind of illustrated by the hands that went up with the sticky notes, many of us, if not all of us, have multiple identities, but the fact that those two positions are being held simultaneously and the perspectives that come along with that kind of really unique expertise, combined expertise, I think is critically important, and I could not find enough words, which is hard for me to express, how much that has fundamentally altered my thinking as a scholar and the partnerships that we collaborate on together. So I really wanted to make sure to emphasize that. And then of course as well, mentoring and learning from full-time students like Corey and many others as well, who have, for example, more protected time to collaborate on projects, I think complements these benefits really nicely. So I think it's a really important kind of both and dynamic. And I guess a couple of final things that I'll say sort of in this section of the discussion is something that I really try to do as a mentor, as I've kind of already mentioned, and thus as a learner, is to really embrace and to celebrate versus force in any way the identities and the expertise that comes along with the identities of the individuals who I'm privileged enough to mentor. And in doing so, not only do our projects benefit immensely, but so do I as a scholar. And we all thought that it would be powerful and kind of conveying this point to share a few very specific, tangible examples of how Destiny, with all of the identities that kind of that she brings to the table, and then Corey as well, how they have fundamentally altered in both kind of macro level and micro level ways my experience as a researcher. So thinking about Destiny, some of you may know that for the better part of like a decade plus, I don't know, the days, the years, they all combine, I've thought a lot about feedback and the motivational consequences of feedback. And a couple of years ago, Destiny and I were chatting about one of our ongoing collaborations, and I was kind of, as usual, Destiny was being a very good sport, I was talking her ear off, and I said, Destiny, you know what, I really think that, I've always thought this, that feedback is such an important avenue or precursor to building teacher-student relationships. And Destiny said, yeah, but trust and strong teacher-student relationships prior to the feedback experience and the feedback process is so important. And if it's not there, especially with more critical feedback, then the relationship is really at a risk of breaking down. And I went, I never thought of that. And based on my kind of expertise or my experiences and the ways that they fell short kind of in relation to Destiny's, that I had totally missed that. And that really important point has not only just sort of stuck with me in my thinking, but informed my conceptual models, informed how I conduct my research now that's kind of really at the heart of my research program on feedback. And thinking more logistically, and I think that we all know that as researchers, logistics and practical considerations are every bit as important as kind of like the deep thinking that we do. So we've talked a lot, of course, throughout this presentation about partnership work. And I suspect that many of us can relate to partnership work being all the more important over the past couple of years, and also all the more challenging because of COVID and the horrible consequences it's had in many schools, in all schools, for students and teachers and everybody involved. And it is simply like the least coincidental thing ever that the one school that has formally agreed to collaborate with us on our partnership moving forward is Destiny School. And speaking of trust, it's exactly kind of, I think, an example of trust and the unique perspective that Destiny brings. And another thing that I'll mention here is that for those of you that were at AERA or familiar with the Division C graduate student competition, Destiny and another PhD student, Danielle Berry, they actually won one of the Shark Tank competition awards based on a partnership that was directly kind of inspired by Destiny's dual identity here. So this just kind of provides a few tangible and I think really important examples of how these kinds of perspectives and the unique expertise that everybody brings to the table fundamentally alters kind of thinking in both macro and micro level ways. And then, just kind of concluding for a minute about Corey's profound impact on my scholarly thinking and how I conduct research and why I conduct research on multiple projects that Corey and I have collaborated on. It's really been Corey's thinking, her positionality, her conviction, I would say, as a researcher that's encouraged me to, and even gave me the idea, to involve the populations with whom we're interested in studying, not only in the data collection process, but in the research formation process. So whether it is involving undergraduate students when we're writing and talking, and actually tomorrow morning we will be, about teaching undergraduate students, involving them as co-authors on the work that we're doing, or involving adolescents in the survey development process. So even kind of forming student advisory groups with adolescent students to pick their brains a little bit more about what's important to them, to make sure that we're asking the right questions, even remotely the right questions, has all been Corey. And it never even would have occurred to me to think to do that if it weren't for kind of her positionality and her thinking in that way. So I'll stop rambling now, but in conclusion, I think that mentorship is really, really an important opportunity to embrace and to celebrate these identities, and I think that everybody benefits from it.
Okay, so now we will allow you guys to engage in our conversation with us and address like anything that you thought were especially important to take away from this conversation, or if you want to open the floor for you to provide insight and experience and answer some of the questions that we asked throughout this presentation. So going back to our questions, one that we asked, the first question that I asked was, what roles or identities do you identify with in the education field? If anybody wanted to talk about the roles or identities that they have or they had in the education field based on the sticky notes that you have, we can do so. Go ahead.
So I've been a pre-KK and first grade teacher. I also have been a district literacy coach and led professional development nationally. But then I've been a graduate student and a researcher. And I feel like with each role, just like y'all are saying, comes a new perspective to look at something, and it's almost like you can't go back to not knowing that before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a mentor, as just someone in, like a colleague or a peer, having those kinds of conversations and being able to talk about the perspective of someone else really opens your eyes to new ideas and experiences.
Thank you. The second question that we asked was, within your research or position in the education field, how have you thought about, or how has your work and perspectives you bring to that work begun to close the gap between research and practice? And our third question was, how have you celebrated and incorporated your mentees' various identities when I'm inviting them to work on projects with you? And as a mentee, how have your various education identities been recognized?
So any thoughts either in response to those specific questions, or just sort of anything that has really, I don't know, that you're really like grappling with or thinking about? I think I saw Avi's hand, and then I see a hand in the back, so maybe we can we'll go back first and then, does that sound good?
Yes.
Right? This is really interesting, and thank you for this. Something I've been kind of grappling with is I was a teacher before COVID, which is not the same, right? And so, working with teachers, I do have all this experience, but I think it's really important. And so, and Destiny, you have this really interesting position where you are, in it right now. And I think there's something really to think about is, even though we have this teaching experience, like so much things have, the longer we're out of the classroom, to think about how we work that into conversations with teachers, in a way of like, I know what you're doing, kind of, kind of thing. And so if you, I don't know, anybody had any thoughts on that? But that's something I just realized that's important to my identity, is that it's mine and it's different.
Does anyone have any? That's Nikki, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see the mask. Hi, Nikki. Does anyone have any, like, either reactions to what Nikki shared, or? I think it's such an important point that you just raised.
Yeah, definitely. And something we talked about too, with the changes with COVID that's been happening, and then also like the ongoing, and that has been present in the United States, like racial injustice too, and how that's changing, and the like attacks of divisive concepts and everything. That's something we talked about too, and so I'd be really interested if anyone has any insight.
I really liked the last thing you said about it's my identity and it's different. And because I think even though a lot of us are sharing the same sticky notes, all of those experiences are all still really different and have different times and different contexts of like what's going on in the world and how it's affecting you individually. So I really like that last line. I feel like we could see it on like a poster or a t-shirt. It's different.
I'm here for the sound.
Next hashtag on Twitter.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I'm grappling with and have been with kind of different aspects of my identities that I currently hold or have held in the past, is I think that Nikki, what you shared illustrates the point really nicely that context change. So, you know, being a teacher, so valuable to have that identity. Being a teacher pre-pandemic is probably very fundamentally different, and at least in certain ways, than being a teacher in 2022. Kind of along the same lines, I think that, so context change, but then also, you know, our psychological thinking as we sort of take on new identities, it changes as well. I'm thinking about kind of my experience as a PhD student, and now I graduated in 2015. That was 7 years ago. My thinking and my kind of like identity, former and I guess still current identity of thinking as a PhD student is now different because of the amount of time that's passed. I think that's important too.
And I can't remember who made the comment, or who asked the question, but when we were doing that activity and somebody had asked, is this for past and current? Especially I think when I asked about being a graduate student, like everybody in here was once a graduate student. And regardless of if you were a teacher 7 years ago or post or pre-COVID, you are still a teacher, and you can still draw from these experiences. Just because you're not in that role anymore, that does not change your experience or what you can draw from.
Yeah, and then I think Avi had his hand up too, and then we can maybe go back.
Yes.
This was just triggering for me is like what the different aspects of my identity, how I have limited knowledge based on the different aspects of my identity. Like, I've never been a teacher, I've been a student, so I need to be very self-aware and honest about what the limits of my knowledge, experiential knowledge can be regarding that. And similarly, like as a former student, graduate student, you know, the landscape looks very different now than it did when I was in school, and acknowledging the limits of my knowledge and then using that to identify like who can I partner with, who can bring in those different perspectives that I need to do the research that I want to do really well and holistically.
Avi?
So to the point that you raised, that we all have the same labels, but even if we're current in the same role, actually our identities are unique in the same way that our students, who all share the same role of students, actually have very different positionalities and perspectives from within the classrooms. And I think that part of what Anya just emphasized, that time has passed from our past role identities, and so what are we taking for granted about what we share with others? And it's not like we don't share with others, we do share with others, but we need also to always keep in mind that the person that we think, oh, you hold the same role or you share the same experience, actually could be very different. So holding multiple identities in past and present, part of what it elicited for me was empathy towards people in different roles. So I was an educational program designer, I was a part-time teacher. It's just being having empathy to the constraints, the lived experience, and coming as a researcher, just asking the questions, what are your concerns? And learning, as you said, Alison, being a learner, but particularly in relation to partnerships, one of the things that have been increasing in my awareness, and it's part of our current project, always on this project, Wendy also, we're collaborating with teachers, novice teachers, and something that probably a lot of people among you who collaborate with teachers are burdened, and particularly around COVID and the change, we work with teachers who all the teacher training was online, and suddenly the first year they were teaching in person, and they were completely overwhelmed. And we have an issue with retention in our project. The teacher said, and now we are upfront, the teachers are co-researchers with us, we're paying them a lot of money in recognition of the effort that they're contributing, and still the teachers say, even doing the little, recording themselves for 15 minutes and writing a page decision memo and then participating in a reflective interview, that was too much, being overwhelmed with what they were doing. And so we've been considering what strategies can we incorporate to be more with them, where they are at. And it's, some of it is constraints of the data that we need, but how can we do the partnerships so that they feel that everything we is involved in the research, they feel benefits them. It's not the role identity of providing data is integrated with the role identity of teacher and how I'm enhanced and empowered as a teacher. So all of these ideas of how do we come to where the teachers are, or our partners are, make them our collaborators and have them own what we're doing so that they feel they're benefited. And it's this mutual sensitivity, mutual empathy and continuous learning.
Great points. I think I've seen Andrew's hand up for once.
So I think this relates to the morning session with Avi this morning about who we are as educational psychologists, because what I wrote down for the positionality part of it is I struggle with, the work that we do in our lab, is it social psychology, is it educational psychology, is it both? And it got me to thinking, am I a psychologist, am I an educational researcher, or am I both? And what impact does that have on practice? And so that is the biggest internal conflict that I have holding these multiple identities, and how the research connects to tangible, deliverable outcomes. Because I think there's differences if you come at it from a social psychology lens versus an ed psychology lens. And so I think that would be what stood out to me. And so I think it's all relevant. We talked about that this morning, about who we are as educational psychologists and what does that mean.
So currently I'm a PhD student, and my dissertation involves working collaboratively with a school. And personally, when thinking about intersectionality and also my positionality, I have not worked as a K-12 educator, so I think part of my in my reflection, my questions were, who am I to kind of ask teachers to even incorporate, even if it's a little thing, to incorporate it into their school day, because they're already so busy, and how do I make research more collaborative in the sense that it also addresses the teacher's goals? I guess these are some questions I was thinking through.
Courtney,
Yeah, Jeff has also had his hand up for a while.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Jeff. Yeah, I was thinking actually a lot about like making sure that we're also addressing the goals and the needs of the teachers and of the students and of the districts that we're working with. And one thing that I've been thinking and sort of grappling with is that I taught upper elementary and middle school, but even that is a pretty narrow identity because then I'm working with the district who's like, we would love for you to work with first grade teachers. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. I can meet this goal, but like I've never had that experience of being a first grade teacher. So it's kind of also shifting, like I identify as this like K-12 educator, but it's my experience is really more with like 3 through 8th graders and then how do I sort of shift and be empathetic and compassionate towards the first grade teachers who are experiencing very different things than I did as a teacher, in addition to thinking about like the different contexts of like COVID and racism and also even the context of like where you are in the country or the community that you're serving too. So I work a lot with students in rural Illinois, and it's very different than students in Chicago or students in Maryland or wherever we are. So kind of grappling with all of those different conflicting goals and conflicting identities too. Or not always conflicting, but sometimes.
I think that gets back to Maggie's point about how, you know, we started with these like categories of labels and there's so much variation and uniqueness subsumed within those, I think. And it also gets back to Annette's point about like being honest about with ourselves and with our collaborators about kind of like what our identities kind of reflect and expertise that comes along with that and what they may not reflect. Jeff?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that really triggered for me when you talk about these different identities, I think I was most successful as a middle school teacher when I was really explicit and my students trusted me that I was also a learner. And part of their job was to teach me how to be a better teacher. And so when I could get them to trust that, which was all the time, because of maybe my behavior or whatever, but there was just a better relationship between us. And I was thinking about that multiple identities, and perhaps at least, I mean I'm new to this, but as educational psychologists, we haven't done as good a job as convincing practitioners that we were in both those roles as well. And so there is a bit maybe a lack of trust. When we go to schools and practitioners and say, hey, guess what, we're here to help. And we haven't built the trust up that says, you know, we're also here to learn from you and to help you. And maybe I don't know how we can be better at that, or how I can be better at that, or help the schools. But it strikes me as that trust issue and that simultaneous multiple identities, helper, learner, whatever that is, that we have to come and bring those together and make it explicit to build that trust.
My trust doesn't build quickly. And so just to build meaningful partnerships, it takes time, so much time to build that trust in, so that you can understand who they are and their needs and their identities, and that they can understand what they're at. Like that's sometimes not something that goes into the conversation about just how much time meaningful partnerships really take to develop. And it's hard when, you know, we need the grant funds now, or we need the partnership for our dissertation now. And so those are conflicting to building up with the supporting things. Those are in conflict often, and so it just takes such a long time.
Molly. I was going to bring it back to what Corey said earlier in the presentation about how when your identity is the norm, you don't necessarily see that as part of your identity. And I think, you know, just being in grad school has made me aware that identity is so important, even if I don't see it in myself. And I think that could lead to not asking your mentors, your mentees, or your collaborators about their identities if yours is just so common. So I really appreciated Corey saying, like, yeah, I'm a full-time student, I know that's really common, but it's also important to me, and that allows me to ask you what your status is as a student or as a collaborator.
Yes.
I might have a different background than most people here in the room. So I'm only in the research side, so I'm researching going into schools side of things. And
I just said only, I just want to take that away from you. You said I'm only, and I just want to take that away from you. Okay, please continue.
Okay, so I think like when we are talking about our own identities and how they impact our research, most of the time we think about how we see things differently, how our positions are valued. But I think we as researchers, when we're going into schools, that lens we hold is more of a mirror or a bias that we have to be aware. Like a lens that, oh, I hold this lens, but that's because I have this bias and I have different backgrounds. But now in your turf, you're teaching me in your schools, because sometimes, seeing this broadly, we researchers sometimes have this kind of arrogance that like, we know better than you professional, like peoples or parents, but they know the situation better than us. And so I think it's really important to us, like, not only we recognize our own values and our lenses, but also its limitations when we're going in. We're taking a civic science perspective that they teach us what they need, the civic science side.
We'll let you be the last question.
Is that Nikki in the back?
Yes.
So I just wanted to say real quick, so one thing I've been thinking about as we talked about this, and it's very clear with this last comment, is what is a partnership? And so I think everyone I've talked to, like when I talk to different people, it means very different things. Some people mean like, I go into a school and I'm like, here's my thing, use it. We partner with them. And then others, it's a co-design, like a research practice partnership, which, you know, so I mean, so that's also things to think about of how you're defining it, because I've heard it used so differently throughout my career that just things to think about.
Well, I think everybody, thank you for all of your comments and questions, and I think that, again, it really showed why this conversation is critical, especially during this time, and as we continue to acknowledge our different roles and identities, and that we are not only one thing.